Good morning to those of you in the Americas. Of course, good afternoon to those of you in Europe and Africa, and good evening to those of you joining us from Asia. My name is Charles Hopkins, and I'm the UNESCO chair at York University, and it's my privilege to be the co-chair of this overall conference. So welcome and a special welcome back to those of you who were with us yesterday. Now, in Canada, at events such as these, we now formally acknowledge that we are on lands previously occupied by our Indigenous people. So I'll begin this opening ceremony by reading the York University Land Acknowledgement. As this event is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for this Great Lakes region. Thank you. This York University conference is co-hosted by York International and our UNESCO chair in Reorienting Education towards Sustainability, but in partnership with the International Association of Universities, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and Okayama University in Japan. And I'm happy to report that approximately now 700 registrants from 70 countries have found the combined efforts from this partnership of important and enough importance to have joined us for the conference. So welcome, especially to those who are coming back and to newcomers. For today's session, I welcome the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, one of our conference partners, to join us and be part of this opening ceremony. I'm grateful that we have two speakers joining us live today. First is Sébastien Goupil, the Secretary General of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and Bushra Ebadi, an Executive Committee member and Youth Advisor for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Sébastien Goupil. I am pleased to say Sébastien is a colleague and a friend who has supported our UNESCO chair ever since he assumed the position of Secretary General 5 years ago. Sébastien, I must say, is familiar with our conference themes of internationalization, sustainability, and inclusivity. He's been extremely successful in bringing formally separated thematic and expert groups from civil society and academia together in a pursuit of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And also, he's a champion of meaningful engagement of youth in the Commission. So, Sébastien, the floor is yours.
Merci, Chuck, for those great words. Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. Hello, Bushra. Thanks, Charles, for this important land acknowledgement. And thanks to all those who are joining. It's quite impressive to see this turnout for this conference, despite, I think, the fatigue for online gathering, but it shows that you're talking about a very important subject. Please allow me to acknowledge myself that I'm speaking today from the traditional unceded territory of the Abenaki and Wabanaki Confederacy. Advancing sustainability, inclusion, and innovations are priorities for us at the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. This is why we didn't hesitate a second to support this important conversation on the future of internationalization in higher education. As you may know, UNESCO stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. As a specialized agency of the UN system, UNESCO plays a very important role in supporting the implementation of Agenda 2030 and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs as we call them, this global blueprint for a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future. UNESCO, we know, is the lead UN agency in coordinating and monitoring Sustainable Development Goal 4, inclusive and equitable quality education for all. This goal has been heavily impacted by the pandemic. We're experiencing a situation that is unprecedented in the history of education. It has revealed alarming structure and equity gaps nearly everywhere, including here in Canada. In response, UNESCO launched, among other initiatives, a global education coalition to monitor access to education around the globe and to share promising practices between member states and how to continue learning during this terrible pandemic. Our Commission is committed to supporting initiatives that seek to achieve the SDGs, such as this very important gathering, as we fulfill our mandate to promote UNESCO's values and carry out its priorities and activities in Canada. And of course, we do this mainly through our very committed and engaged members, networks, and partners, such as the Canadian UNESCO Chairs Network that Chuck mentioned. Our 28 UNESCO chairs are specifically designated by UNESCO to accelerate the implementation of Agenda 2030 through training, research, capacity building, and program development, including, of course, in higher education. Given the unique position they hold in the research and UN ecosystems, they foster quite innovative and unique forms of solidarity and intellectual cooperation across the global north and south. They, in fact, play a crucial role to make multilateralism function despite extremely challenging and polarized geopolitical contexts. The UNESCO chair at York University in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability is a true demonstration of how impactful the work of UNESCO chairs can be. And I would like, of course, to take this opportunity to acknowledge the incredible leadership exercised by Charles Hopkins over the years and his efforts to mobilize networks and knowledge to advance sustainable development within our education systems. I would also like to acknowledge the participation in this conference of our very own president, Yad Vassar, who also happens to hold the UNESCO chair. It shows how seriously we take this network. You're also about to hear from Bushra. Chuck mentioned it. She's the president of our youth advisory group, who works tirelessly and support our very own efforts to advance youth agency and give a voice to the most marginalized segments of our society. While reflecting on the internationalization of higher education, one of our preoccupations as a commission is to ensure that no one is left behind in accessing education and that students can learn from where they live while experiencing learning in different contexts other than from their own. And I'm thinking in particular about the millions of migrants and refugees who face incredible hardship to access any form of education, including in camps where they are often forced to live for years. As education systems around the world are still grappling with the impacts of the pandemic, we must ask ourselves how they can improve to help address the world's most pressing challenges and provide access to students, including the most marginalized ones. We have now fully entered the decade of action, a reminder that the clock is ticking, that 2030 is less than 10 years away. And when it comes to SDG 4, this most unusual year has shifted our views on what education can and should look like. It starts with many of the solutions proposed by post-secondary institutions, such as yours. It starts with maximizing the use of technology to keep teaching and learning accessible, relevant and engaging during these unprecedented times. It starts with linking learners and educators from around the globe so that we can learn from one another through events such as this one. And if, of course, we do it right, it ends with SDG 4, education for all, with no one left behind. We need to intensify our efforts and work creatively across the globe, bring to the table all of our various allies, wherever they are, to shape a much more inclusive, sustainable, and equitable future for education. I wish you all very fruitful and inspiring exchanges. Merci, thank you for the invitation. Chimigwech.
Thank you very much, Sébastien, for those great opening remarks. It's now my pleasure to welcome Bushra Ebadi. As well as I mentioned, she sits on the executive committee of the Canadian National Commission, and she's also a youth advisor. But as well as that, Bushra is a social innovator. Sorry, Bushra, this is terrible. Bushra is a co-founder of the Health and Information Literacy Access Alliance and a youth ambassador for the UNESCO-led Global Alliance for Partnerships on Media and Literacy. She's also the global advisor to Chebbi, the African Union Youth Envoy, and in her role as a member of the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response. And Bushra, with my apologies, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, and no problem. There's always a lot of titles to get through, formalities. But I'm really excited to be with you here today and with all of our attendees and community. I'd like to thank all of you for sharing this space with me. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm currently meeting all of you from the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, where for thousands of years Indigenous peoples have inhabited and cared for this land. And in particular, I'm acknowledging the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I'm really grateful to be working on this land, and by doing so, giving my respect to its first inhabitants and those who still reside here as First Nations and who have welcomed newcomers onto this land. And I think it's really important to center our conversations around our histories, but also the current realities that exist, including the continued marginalization and oppression of Indigenous peoples and other racialized communities as well, including people of African descent or Black people. To begin, I think there was a brief introduction already about kind of the different hats I'm wearing or the different roles that I have. But I think the underlying thing that's of importance to me is ensuring that we're working collectively to advance peace, justice, and the agency of especially marginalized communities globally, and using multiple approaches to do so. So doing so at the local, the national, and global levels to really make sure that we're achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in meaningful ways, and that it isn't just sustainable development for a select group of people. As the pandemic has really impacted all of us in really unique ways, I think there's sometimes a narrative about how the virus itself doesn't really see the different identities that we hold. It doesn't discriminate, but in fact, I think despite it not being intentional about how it's targeting people, the pre-existing socioeconomic inequalities, the structural inequalities that exist in our societies and communities have really been exacerbated as a result of COVID-19, and showed us how those communities that are most marginalized are being especially impacted. And I think that our focus and attention needs to be paid to this as we move forward, and to not think about just having reactionary interventions that are really just band-aid solutions to some of the problems that we're facing, but really look at how we can transform systems to, again, advance justice and equity. So in particular, COVID-19 has had a profound impact on students and young people during this time. While it hasn't necessarily resulted in high numbers of deaths or mortality rates amongst young people, it's really resulted in a lot of young people not being in school. So we're seeing at this point in time like historic numbers of people who are not in classrooms, or who have alternatively moved to online learning, which is also impacting particular groups of people who don't have access to internet. And even when they do have access to internet, their lived realities are such that they're not able to meaningfully engage online. And I think some of the ways that we think about learning have also been transformed in really tangible ways that don't get necessarily discussed in mainstream discourse. And so an example of that is the impact that going online has had on our ability to connect with one another as peers. So peer-to-peer learning has definitely been impacted. And I think for a lot of us who have been privileged to access educational institutions, we've really gained a lot from not only learning from our professors and teachers, who obviously play a critical role in educational institutions, but also from our, and so when you're in these online spaces, it can be really difficult to engage with one another. And I think through those engagements, we're really engaging in active relationship building and learning what it means to be a global citizen. So thinking beyond borders in particular, not just global in the sense of geography, but global in the sense of across disciplines, across sectors, across identities, applying this intersectional lens to the way that we, again, engage in education, in learning, in peace building, in sustainable development as a collective. And I think those are really critical aspects that we need to prioritize moving forward, is how do we, as we're transitioning to more digitized learning, especially if that is going to be the case. And I think I don't think that digital education is meant to also replace in-person education. I think there's values and positive aspects to both types of learning. And there's also nature-based learning, which a lot of that has been really learned from Indigenous communities and really diverse communities around the world as traditional ways of knowledge. As I think about the way that this pandemic has impacted diverse communities, I also think about our understanding of what education means. So applying an intersectional and global lens to education is critical. It also is really important to think about how we're defining, understanding, and valuing knowledge. Whose knowledge do we value? And so this is a moment in time where we can really think about transforming systems, in particular education systems. When we think about internationalizing them, it's really, I think, about thinking beyond nation-to-nation relations and thinking about a more globalized perspective that, again, goes beyond geographical understandings, and more about those relationships that we have with one another, to the environment, to our communities, and really centering that, again, as we move forward. And so for myself, something that I've really been thinking about in particular is the impact that my own identity has had in shaping my experience with education systems. So my parents were refugees and were forcibly displaced from Afghanistan. And so I was born 2 years after they arrived in Canada. And I find that in a lot of ways, our educational institutions don't necessarily acknowledge all of our shared histories, but also the unique aspects of our cultural identities, other parts of our identities. And yet it is also a forum where this can actually really be celebrated, be honored, the multiple identities that we hold and the histories that we bring to the table. And I think by learning those histories, we can actually move forward in acts of reconciliation that are really meaningful, that are rooted in truth, which is, I think, one of the core aspects of the truth and reconciliation process in Canada, that truth precedes the reconciliation itself, that we need to acknowledge the histories that we have and the current situation that we're also in. So I think with that being said, I just want to, again, prioritize and say that even through the work of the Commission, what we're trying to do is mainstream young people and honor the multiple identities that they hold, and not see them as tokenized individuals to just check off a box and say that we've engaged with a certain group of people, but rather make sure that they're involved in decision making, in the development of programs, in the implementation of programs, and really shaping the strategies that we're collectively developing to advance sustainable development goals moving forward.
Thank you very much, Sébastien and Bushra, for sharing your insight and kicking off the discussion for the second conference day. I also want to recognize the valuable contribution of the Canadian Commission as a partner, and in particular the work of Isabelle Leversasson. So thank you very much. For those of you joining us today for the first time, I'd like to take a few moments to share some of yesterday's highlights. And a special thanks to the team of rapporteurs that captured the essence of the discussions, not only for the publication that will follow our conference, but to give us a few highlights just to share today. So first of all, encouraged by the address of Dr. Van Lant, the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities, and by York University President Lanton stating her commitment to the SDGs as a grand challenge for York, promoting a broad approach towards internationalization and global outreach in yesterday's opening ceremony, we moved to the first plenary on mobility in higher education. In the plenary, it was noted that mobility offers the opportunity for knowledge transfer and intercultural exchange, but mobility should digress from the sole focus on physical movement, to rather welcoming and recognizing the mobility of ideas, of experiences, perspectives, and knowledge. COVID-19 has shown virtual learning is important, but no real substitute for the personal experience. Universities now are urged to rethink the conventional models of mobility towards also a more value-oriented approach. Now, in the panel on international mobility in practice, the speakers shared broad conceptual ideas of the UN mandate, but they also included concrete best practice examples. And some highlights include expanding opportunity and access in higher education through international mobility is important, specifically for gender empowerment and equity, but also for other pressing issues mentioned right across all 17 of the SDGs. Internationalization, including mobility as an element, should be linked to a whole institution approach, going beyond curriculum and addressing research, community service, and even the operations of the university. And some successful examples where joint degree programs were developed and carried out between universities and approaches to reach out to other institutions beyond higher education to create exchange opportunities for students and staff. And virtual collaboration is further on the rise, but virtual mobility will not replace traditional mobility, but it is a solid chance to enhance access and inclusivity. The panel on greening student and scholar exchange focused on new ways and successful solutions to make higher education mobility more inclusive and sustainable for young people globally. Now, innovative approaches for more awareness of the ecological footprint, for instance, caused by travel, to making more conscious decisions or creating new ways of virtually, visually, and even artistically working together through GIS mapping and other examples were presented. The importance of building human relationships beyond home remains a valuable life experiences, and universities do have a responsibility to make exchange more accessible and inclusive for all. And lastly, the importance of genuine youth engagement in all aspects, as Bushra just highlighted again, in all aspects, to reform exchange programs and so on was stressed. So that's sort of a wrap up of yesterday, and I have a couple of housekeeping announcements. First of all, the poster presentations will be open all day. Please feel free to attend the booths at your leisure. And the conference includes several cultural interventions as we are learning how to include culture in the virtual space. So please take the time and remain in the sessions to enjoy the performance as the sessions conclude. Also, regarding the declaration, we are still welcoming your comments and feedback on the conference declaration, but only until noon today. We will close it and do the final draft. And now I would like to invite everyone to proceed to the plenary 2 on student and professional mobility, and chaired by a fellow UNESCO chair and colleague, the president of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, Liette Vasseur. Thank you.